Can me feel it, you? You get me, got you. You get me, can me feel it, you? You get me.
Hi, I'm Corey Nathan, and this is Talking Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other. Your home for engaging conversations about the topics that matter most in our culture. If you love nuance, if you want to better understand different points of view, if you're tired of the screamers taking all the oxygen out of the room, if you'll enjoy edifying, provocative, and fun conversations among high-profile public figures and regular folks like me, you love talking politics and religion without killing each other. Thanks for spending some time with us. Enjoy today's show. Welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. I'm your host, joined by my esteemed co-host, Jessica Stone. Jessica, always good to see you. How are you doing?
Good to see you too. Happy Friday.
Happy Friday. And we are co-produced by my pal, Tristan Drew. And as always, if you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, leave us a review and comments on iTunes, wherever you get your podcasts, and give us a shout on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. We'd love to hear from you. Today's guest, Daniel Lippman, is a reporter for Politico covering the White House and Washington. He was one of the co-authors of Politico's Playbook, the unofficial guide to official Washington. Prior to Politico, Daniel worked for outlets such as Reuters, McClatchy Newspapers, Huffington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. And very much like one of our prior guests, Julie Mason, Daniel is one of today's staunchest ambassadors for good journalism and champions of good journalists. Daniel, thank you so much for coming in. How are you doing?
Good. Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Good to have you.
Great to have you. So you're originally from Western Massachusetts?
I am. So I'm from a place called the Berkshires, a town called Great Barrington, which is a town of about 7,000 people. It's a pretty liberal area, which is kind of surprising when out of the 400 people who have been arrested from, in the Capitol riots, my small county of 120,000 people, 3 of them have been, in that 400 group. And so I get my local newspaper sends out breaking news alerts every time a new person from the Berkshires gets arrested.
Oh, gosh.
Oh, wow.
But it's kind of a reminder that the people who stormed the Capitol came from all walks of life, from all areas of the country, including pretty, areas that are full of former hippies and people who, eat granola and like organic food and arugula.
Wow. That's not necessarily a distinction for your hometown that you'd want, but I wonder.
I know. They're not from my hometown, but the home county. And so there's parts of the area.
He wants a little separation there, Corey. Come on.
Yeah.
Plausible deniability.
And I don't know any of those people. So.
You should have had the exclusive if you did, right?
I know.
Interestingly, I live in LA County, and LA County is very, very, it's like Democrat plus 30 or something. But I live in a town, the Santa Clarita Valley, that historically has been very, very red. We had Buck McKeon serve as our congressman here for 20 something years, and it's just recently with some expansion, suburban sprawl. We're kind of like the new Orange County that we're. Katie Hill was our representative here for a year and a half, but it went back to red. So it's an interesting little enclave within LA County. One thing I wanted to ask you about is it looks like you identified journalism as something that you were passionate about from a very early age. Is that right?
Yeah. And so growing up in a small town, I was 11 and a half when 9/11 hit, and we didn't have a TV growing up in terms of cable news or even that network news. And so I started reading the newspaper and got really interested in stuff that was happening all around the world that was more exciting and more interesting than my local hometown. And so that's how I kind of got my interest in journalism. I also would send in links and typos and corrections to reporters when I was in high school and college, thousands of times. When I see errors that they had written, you're working for a major news outlet. Shouldn't you at least read your story after it gets published, not before? And so Politico profiled me for doing that. And then when I was in high school, I got another write-up in the New Yorker because I would The Bush White House had something called Ask the White House, which was an online blog forum where regular Americans could submit questions to senior officials, and they would get answered in a Q&A format. And so I submitted a lot of questions, and many of them were answered.
I have to ask you, Daniel, if you ever ran up against any of the journalists that you plagued with your typo corrections later in life, and if any of them ever knew that it was you and had words with you, or if it created any waves in your relationships in Washington?
Yeah, that's a great question. Most of them were actually pretty grateful at having a reader that was curious enough and would read their entire story instead of just the headline or the first few paragraphs. And so I got mostly good feedback, but I've definitely had a couple encounters where people were aren't you the guy that would send in those type of emails, which I did not appreciate. And if someone said when I was doing that, they said, don't email me, I would of course respect that. But most people did not say that. A lot of people just said thank you, or they didn't reply.
Was there an objective there? Did you want to make a connection? Was it your sort of tool that you used in order to make a connection with journalists? Or was it just that, like my mother was a 35-year kindergarten teacher, and she's one of those, I'm correcting your grammar as you're speaking kind of a person?
I guess I'm very detail oriented and, obsessed with facts and making sure everything is correct. And so kind of type A in that way, but it was not meant as a, I want to get ahead or I want to make a ton of connections. And so I only used the utility of that after, when I realized, hey, can I get a tour of your newsroom, or, can we get coffee? And then, so it was not, I did not start it with the intention of kind of leveraging it for job, internships and all that. One person I remember who worked for a wire service, he said, I garden as a hobby. Why is sending typo emails one of your hobbies? And so it was actually just a kind of fun hobby. I was surprised that the copy editing machinery in American newsrooms had been steadily declining because they faced cutbacks in recent years.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you're the kind of person that diagrams sentences too back in the day. If you've got that strange pleasure about charting a sentence and finding where the pronoun goes versus the object and all that.
Not like,
are you quite at that level?
Not at the, in real time as much. I know some people who are, and they will, correct me sometimes, but I'm more kind of on the written page. I see stuff that would jump out at me. So every time I read, I always read my stories before they go up, but I read them after too, because sometimes when it's published, you see there's a missing a comma, but I don't send those emails anymore. Sometimes I'll see something that should be fixed on our website, a small little thing, and then I'll email our production team. But besides that, I'm kind of out of the correction business.
It makes sense that was one of your hobbies, because one of your first jobs when you were in college was as a fact checker. How did that must come in really handy now. I was curious how that informs how you've gone about your work as a journalist going forward.
Yeah, so I guess it was not as much about being a fact checker. Basically, I was, my first full-time job out of college was working for Mike Allen as the researcher and then eventually the co-writer of Playbook. And so I guess having the experience and just the knowledge of how facts are so important in journalism, that if you don't spell people's names properly or get people's titles right, and people notice that, especially if you have informed readers, then how can they trust the credibility, or how can they believe the rest of what you're writing, especially in a highly charged partisan atmosphere where both sides are looking for anything small that they can use against the media. And then during the Trump administration, the media was kind of the enemy. We didn't want to be, at least among nonpartisan journalists. It's not why I went into journalism, to do battle against or for any political party. It's more about investigating and holding power accountable. And there's a market for that. And so with Playbook, it was a lot of discrete facts, fact checking the birthdays, or making sure.
Oh my gosh, that sounds so arduous. There's a lot of birthdays in Playbook.
Making sure that people's transitions were described properly in terms of what people's next jobs were in DC, and it's all these different items that make up Playbook. You really want to kind of have that as iron tight as possible. And so, especially with, I remember sometimes a newsletter will say it's Monday when it's actually Tuesday. That happens like maybe once a year for, people sleep deprived. But so we'd always get a number of emails if that happened. But I think that's kind of been that hasn't happened in a while, thank God. And I'm not involved we have a whole new Playbook team that is doing a great job that started in January. I'm really excited by what they're doing with the product, but I'm still a dedicated reader and will flag things to them as well.
I want to pick up on what you said about Mike Allen. I came to town right as he was starting Politico in 2007. And, for the audience that may not know Mike's name as broadly he is a legend in Washington political journalism. He really took you under his wing? What is it that you think he saw in you? And is there a singular bit of wisdom he passed on that you find you still use or rely on to this day?
I think he kind of saw that we were similar people in some respects in terms of just being news junkies and sponges for information and facts and, news about the media too. And so sometimes that can get characterized as navel gazing, but journalists love to read about other journalists. And there's a lot of people who aren't in journalism who like to read about media as well. And so I think it was kind of we like the, politics, just kind of tracking it's a horse race too, but it's also, there's real impacts on society. And so, not losing sight of that. And so I think he kind of saw someone that he could mentor. And I was very grateful, and I am very grateful for that. And I think also, one lesson he gave to me, which was treat everybody every day like it's their birthday, which is kind of a motto for being nice to people. And so maybe I'm sometimes too nice and you never want to be taken advantage of for one's niceness. But
well, and then of course he actually knows everybody's birthday on top of that.
Yeah.
Now you do too. So you can call people on their birthday. Have you ever used that?
I text people a lot, just to wish them happy birthday. But I think the lesson from that was, if you want to have a long career in Washington, you don't want to make too many enemies, and you want to feel like that people you deal with, that you're square with them, and that even if you're writing a tough story, that you're giving them the fair shake, and that you're really describing accurately, what happens in Washington. And so that's a very highly held principle to Mike and to me, and it's drilled into every journalist at Politico and every other major reputable outlet.
What are some of the ways that you learned how to do good reporting and to learn how to write well?
So I had great English teachers at my high school at Hotchkiss, and it was a boarding school in Connecticut. And then I had good teachers at my elementary and middle school, which my grandmother actually founded. So at one point she had like 6 grandkids going to this school, a Steiner school, at the same time. And so there was we didn't have standardized tests. It was a private school. And so, we weren't taking there's a Massachusetts standardized test called the MCAS, I think. And so it was more about it was kind of a Montessori type school in terms of teaching the importance of creativity and being not kind of following your interests. And so if your parents are consultants or doctors, that doesn't mean necessarily you should be one too. And so you should just follow kind of where your interests and your passions lie, because that's where you will do much better and enjoy your career much more. And so in terms of reporting, when I was working on Playbook, I didn't have a ton of time to do standalone stories, since it was a pretty rigorous space of there's so many source emails to answer and people wanting their jobs or their links or articles in Playbook. And so that was when I had an idea, I would go to Mike and say, is this a good idea? And then he would say yes or no. And then I would get usually another editor to actually edit the piece. And so you just kind of learn with, one of my editors was Rick Burke, he started STAT, which is done pretty well covering the coronavirus pandemic, a health and science publication. Michael Crowley he was my editor for a little bit. My current editor, Blake Hounshell, he's a managing editor for Washington Politics, and I'm very grateful to him. And he's just a supreme editor and seeing where the story is and how I can kind of tell it, because without a good editor, reporters, unless you have a Substack that you've hired some editor for, you really need someone to push you to say, hey, have you talked to this person, or here's some ideas, and here's how we should structure the story. And so it's kind of just like any craft in terms of you learn by doing, and that you should never take shortcuts, and that, I try to not tweet that much in terms of, especially not opinions, but just in general, if I'm on Twitter, then that means, and I see what people have reported already, that means I have not, that means that it's already out there. And so I try to stay off Twitter as much as possible, because I will not be able to get an original scoop that way. Sometimes you'll get sources on Twitter that will reach out to you. But if it's already tweeted about, then usually that means that it's kind of too late to report on, at least for me, since I'm covering more breaking news. I'm not covering as much the day-to-day, what did Biden say today? What is a cabinet secretary? I'm not going to cabinet departments and writing down what they say at a press conference. That
must be a very difficult balance now, trying to balance between breaking a story and getting it right. How do you figure out that tension? I think it's just a matter of having good sources, and sources that are trustworthy, and that if you have sources that mislead you, then you shouldn't deal with them. And so it's kind of built on trust and also due diligence, and working to verify the information, and making sure that you've you have stories that actually that hold up. During the Trump administration, we were kind of drinking from a higher fire hose, and during the Biden administration, it's a little more staid, and there's less palace intrigue, and so that kind of makes it a little harder for journalists like myself to cover chaos in the presidential administration or the White House if there's less chaos. And so we're not going to make up the chaos. And so, but there's 1,400 political appointees at least. There will people will trip up. I've already written about 2 chiefs of staff at various Biden cabinet level departments. So one was, she planned a 50-person indoor party celebrating Deb Haaland's confirmation at the Interior Department, and they had to cancel it after coronavirus concerns. And so then she later was pushed out by the White House and moved to be a senior counsel at the Interior Department. Another person, a week or so later, was the presumptive chief of staff at the U.S. mission to the UN, and she had issues with her security clearance. It was revoked, and so I broke the news on that. And so it's kind of finding those sweet spots where you can make an impact and you can move the ball forward, because usually these government agencies and people in power, they would rather just have it kind of, they're not going to preemptively leak that usually. And so, but it's important stories to be told, and people are interested in those types of pieces.
I'm curious, because you did cover the White House when you were doing the playbook as well. So you've covered the Trump administration, how you see the difference in the evolution of the press corps. I mean, we are not seeing every briefing televised like we were in the beginning of the Trump administration. And I know there's concern that the press corps should be as dogged as it was under Trump. Do you think there's a temptation not to be, because there isn't the same acrimony between the person in the White House and the press corps?
I think there's less acrimony because we're not being accused of being, fake news and
the enemy of the people.
Yeah, all that stuff. And so But I think there should still be a healthy tension because, I didn't go into journalism to do PR for any administration. And so they have tons of PR people that, they've hired in communications roles. I think there was a stat that, there's like 7 PR people to journalists just across America in terms of industry. And that trend has gotten worse. And so when I kind of get random pitches from people pitching energy news from Houston from a big PR firm, I'm thinking, don't they know what I cover? Which is not energy usually. And so, but I think there's journalists should be asking tough questions of the Biden administration in terms of, are they going to work with how effectively are they going to work with Republicans to make the infrastructure package bipartisan? Are they, is there a Russia and North Korea and Iran strategy working when you have Iran kind of being suspected of targeting Israel and the other, and vice versa? And, are you going to, how can you be effective in terms of climate change if you're not asking agriculture to do their part? And so there's plenty of policy and some personnel questions that, should be asked of Jen Psaki and others in the administration, and Biden himself. He doesn't seem to have, he has only had one press conference in his first 100 days.
Yeah.
He's trying to limit that. When he does answer questions from reporters, they're often kind of brief. And so Trump was much more accessible, and the Biden people are much more tightened up. And so they usually prefer their communications people to be actually dealing with journalists instead of non-comms people. So it's kind of a edict, unwritten rule, or even in some cases, I think the White House tells people, if you get a question from a journalist, just route it to the comms people, which I guess I can understand why they're doing that, but it does across administrations. When I call up a communications person to get comment on something, often I'm informing them because things are often tightly held where the press office doesn't know everything that is happening across a government.
The rhetoric at times aimed at journalists and about journalists, certainly under the Trump administration, was heated, to say the least, in ways that I can't imagine you anticipated as a, young aspiring journalist. How did you deal with that, during that time? And have you noticed if the rhetoric, if the heat has been dialed down a bit since the end of the Trump administration and since his removal from major social platforms?
In terms of how I dealt with it, I try not to take any, attacks personally, because it's not in my interest to feel personally wounded or hurt by people criticizing my work. And so there are always going to be trolls on Twitter that, want to call you names or criticize your work. And I choose not to engage in responding, because then that kind of elevates that person. And so, Trump, I think, called a couple of my stories. He questioned whether they were right, and they all, stood up in terms of, stories that he had, that he was responding to that I had done. There was a couple of them, including one where his personal assistant, Madeline Westerhout, she had too much to drink and then started criticizing Tiffany Trump. And
that was a great one. That was a really epic one.
And other Trump, I think Barron Trump too, a little bit. Yeah. So I think I got written up a couple of pages in Westerhout's book when she kind of covered that episode. And so that is, it's always fun to be in books, right?
Yeah.
He said with his tongue in his cheek.
When you meet them, you're like, "Hi, I'm Daniel Lippman, page 234.
Yeah, if I run across her, I'll get word that I thought she actually did portrayed me fine. So didn't have any issues with that, really.
I wanted to ask you because, we're talking about the tension between the Trump administration and the White House press corps, and the healthy tension between any White House and the press corps. But obviously there's a trust deficit with the broader public and reporters. And there was that Reporters Without Borders study that was released this week that 59% of people polled in 28 countries claimed that journalists, quote, deliberately try to mislead the public by reporting information they know is false. What does that tell you about the state of journalism more broadly, and how does it shape how you think about your role as an ambassador for good journalism, or as somebody who maybe is trying to correct that perception?
I think it's it's an unfortunate perception, and I think it's kind of contradicted in some ways by the huge increase in subscriptions that Washington Post, Politico, New York Times, Wall Street Journal got during the Trump years, and the record amount of money and viewers that CNN and MSNBC got. And so I think it's kind of, there's an impact in terms of when people in power, especially Donald Trump and the Republican Party, has kind of made the media the enemy, even more so than sometimes Democrats. And so, rhetoric has real consequences. And so people would not have stormed the Capitol if Trump had not kind of been feeding the fire during the previous 2 months. And so I think that kind of, it puts the responsibility on journalists to try to listen to everyday Americans and try to figure out how we can get the trust back. I think there's been some polls that trust went up slightly. And so, in the last few years, but we all saw the media all criticized each other when, after 2016, everyone was surprised Trump was elected. When there was, if you had been in kind of coal country or Ohio or Florida, you would not be surprised because people were saying, I'm voting for Trump and Hillary, can't trust her and she's weak and all that. And so I think journalists kind of have to tell the story, and it's hard to do in terms of how most journalists go into journalism for the right reasons, that they just want to tell the truth and they want to hold power accountable, and they're not partisans. I think journalists would be wise to not get too opinionated on Twitter, because often those opinions would be liberal and kind of a Upper West Side type mentality. People who are on TV a little bit too much in terms of thinking that what they think matters, when if you're an opinion journalist, of course, you can say whatever you want on Twitter. But if you're a news journalist, then you have to kind of consider your tweets as and what you say on TV in a long arc where you need to be measured in what you say, and you can't be seen as taking one side or another in terms of story selection or what you share. And so, whatever I share is my barometer. Is it interesting? Is it new? Has someone else tweeted about it? Then I will often not pull the excerpt. And so everyone should follow me on Twitter, but they should expect more of my stories than just random pontificating.
So just do a good job, and that's the best way to cut through the perception. Just do good reporting, good journalism. That's a great point. I think at any given media outlet, we'll take Fox News as a very visible example. We could point to any number, and we could point to any number of media outlets for this question. At an organization like Fox News, there are some solid ethical journalists. Chris Wallace, Bret Baier come to mind. Then there are people who are clearly opinionators. We all know who they are. But then there are others who are basically opinionators masquerading as real news people, like Maria Bartiromo comes to mind, somebody like that. But do you think that's the case at most news outlets? And what are some ways consumers of news can discern the difference?
I think at most, at many TV channels, there will be people who are supposed to be nonpartisan journalists, but I think they look at their audience more. And so at Fox, they're not going to have too many stories that are critical of their viewers. And so, and on other networks, I'm sure that, even if they do excellent work, it's sometimes hard to people who are big Trump supporters or former officials sometimes don't want to go on because it's not their type of, audience that they want to get at. And so it's so important just to have different perspectives. And so, intellectual journalism on the right, took a big hit when a publication like the Weekly Standard closed down because that was much more self-critical of the Republican Party. And it's important for both parties to have publications which criticize their own side and not just, are chest beating and saying, and, trying to advantage their own side. Because in the long term of a political party, unless you have publications or outlets that kind of do their own self-reviews and self-correcting, then that's not a good recipe for a long-term success of a Republican Party or a Democratic Party, because then you get in terms of groupthink, and you just think that whatever you did before was correct. And so you need kind of a healthy checks and balances. And for a news consumer, if you're a liberal, you should be looking at Drudge, you should be looking at, the Federalist, or even places, like National Review, or even just checking out what Fox is saying, because that's, Tucker Carlson show is the most popular on air. And so on cable. And so even if you don't agree with Tucker, I think there is people, it's kind of his show is a fact of life, and they're not going to cancel his show. And so I'm not endorsing anyone watching any particular show, but just kind of knowing what the other side is watching. Or if you're a conservative watching MSNBC or CNN, and looking at HuffPost or The Nation, the American Prospect, there's value in that, because then you can kind of even develop better arguments for your own side if you know what the opposition is saying.
So diversify your news consuming portfolio. It's good. Some of my favorite outlets right now are independent outlets like the Dispatch. They're doing some good work, both commentary as well as reporting. Bulwark, more commentary. Charlie Sykes outlet. Jessica, you've been at various. You've been, as a freelance reporter and staff. I'm curious what your thoughts on that is. How can consumers of news be more discerning? How can we tell the difference between the example that I used before, between real journalists and opinionators masquerading as journalists?
I think citation is an important thing to look for. Citation of sources. The more on the record sources, the better. With an understanding that not everybody's going to go on the record, and that's increasingly the case in political journalism. But I guess and I'm sure, Daniel, you have this too. Like, I have sort of an innate meter that says, oh, wow, they're pushing a perspective here. And I don't know exactly how to put that into other people, but we need to kind of understand, okay, well, if my worldview is over here, then this seems, just being able to identify, I think, how different schools of thought think, and be able to identify, therefore, what kind of agenda is being pushed in a given article, if there is one. But if you're looking for something really, really neutral, then I don't even think it's anymore just who's publishing it. I don't think it's that simple anymore, because there are neutral journalists at all of the outlets, and then there are opinion journalists at a lot of the outlets too.
No, I think that in recent years, I think especially with the rise of Twitter and cable news, journalists are defined less by who they work for, and more just kind of by their own journalistic brand. And so if you look at the Maggie Habermans of the world, or Yashar Ali,
Robert Costa,
Robert Costa, people who would you'll read no matter who they work for, even if they're like independent, like Yashar, Ben Smith, there's a number of others that as they kind of jump around, you continue to follow them, and they have a good reputation. And so I think having a good reputation among both sides, that's like very important, not just kind of catering to one side or the other.
Right. I heard you mention writers like David Brooks and Tom Friedman as the kinds of thinkers and writers that you aspire to, or you look to their writing as a standard. What is it about their writing that inspires you, or that you look to as a good example?
I think with David Brooks, he worked for the Weekly Standard before the Wall Street Journal, and so he kind of grew up in that intellectual tradition. I just like the way he described society. He had a book called Bobos in Paradise about how the bourgeoisie were coming together as kind of being merged with the more people who are hippies almost. And so I have always enjoyed his columns because you learn something. And so it's tough being like a New York Times or Washington Post columnist where you have to produce sometimes twice a week and new ideas. And so that is challenging. And I don't know if I would ever want to make that switch, but I think Brooks once said he liked to talk to 3 politicians a day, and that would inform him about what Congress and what Washington was working on and how they thought about the world. And I think I once attended a Faith Angle Forum, which is part of the Ethics and Public Policy Center, kind of a conservative think tank focused on religious issues. And Brooks was one of the guest speakers, and he talked about how he comes up with how he puts together his column ideas, which is, you look at New York Times op-ed column, it's maybe 10 paragraphs or so, and he will have research that kind of articles, other printouts, and he'll lay it on the ground on his floor, and there'll be a small little pile for every paragraph in terms of what underlies it. And so that was a very interesting way of kind of thinking about how to produce columns. And it feels like at the New York Times they get lifelong tenure as columnists, and I'm sure sometimes they kind of step away, but it's kind of hard to do that when you have such an influential audience and you're paid well and you're at the top of your profession like that.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you this question. I was really curious about what it's like to work at Playbook from the vantage point that I just remember seeing Mike Allen everywhere around town, and just like a logistics question. How do you get everywhere in a given evening? I mean, this is all, of course, before COVID. Did you have a calendar and plot out geographically? I'm going to go here for 15 minutes, and then I'm going to go across town. I mean, you have to be ubiquitous.
Yeah, I think you're an ambassador. You're carrying the flag, and so that was just kind of a great way to meet sources. And I would go to lots of parties, and I think I stepped off Playbook almost 2 years ago. But in the 5 years that I was doing it, it was a lot of I woke up at 3:30 to 4 a.m. To write it with Mike and then Jake Sherman, Anna Palmer, and so I guess I just don't require that much sleep. I don't drink coffee in the morning, and so but it's pretty fun. And so in terms of logistics, it was just kind of a lot of source coffees and drinks and dinners. And
yeah, but there's a nightlife. You did have to get out and about for a few hours at night.
Not every night, but it can take you don't want to get burnt out. But I think it was kind of most, you'd have to kind of plot which parties to go to. And when it was the Christmas party season, and then also the White House Correspondents' Dinner weekend. Yeah. And that's where you have, the 3 parties or 4 parties, and you can only go to 2, and traffic is a mess. And so, but that's, it's exciting. And, to get kind of, and I always try to get cell phone numbers of top officials that I'm meeting, so that you guys, that you kind of continue to develop sources, and you can try to best serve your readers by getting access to top decision makers.
So it's a matter of cultivating relationships. I'm curious about one aspect of it. Inevitably, you have to, there's this tension between what a communications director, the stories they want you to tell, and the actual story. How do you maintain those relationships you need in order to do your job as a reporter, when sometimes you end up reporting a story those communications directors and elected officials don't like?
I think what you tell those people is that, there's going to be some good stories, there's going to be some bad stories, but it's kind of, you win some, you lose some. I can't only do stories that those people will like, because that's kind of not my role. And so I just kind of go where my tips lead me, focusing, trying my best to focus on kind of the personnel in Washington, and, battles between political appointees and career officials. And so, I think you just have, you are respectful and you tell the comms people or the politicians, sometimes there's stories you're not going to like the story, but other times let's work together more, or break news with me about whatever you're going to do. And so that's kind of how I think about stuff.
How did you deal with that, Jessica? Is it similar? Just do your job, try not to have an axe to grind, report fairly, report the facts, and that would win out ultimately?
Yeah, but I can't underestimate or let the audience underestimate the pressure that they put on you to change the story or to try to, give you a reason why you should be more circumspect in reporting the story. I mean, you'll hear all kinds of reasons, you're going to ruin your national security, or, they'll throw anything if it protects their boss. So yeah it's, you got to have a strong sense of duty to the reader or the viewer, for sure.
I think it's kind of just a way of, you have to, preserve your credibility and kind of be seen as you're almost like an umpire. You call it like it is. And there's a way to, be a fair journalist without, you don't want them to roll over. You don't want to roll over every time they say, oh, this is outrageous, or, I'll never talk to you again. And which is sometimes, funny when they do talk to you again after you print the story, or they have to apologize. And so that's just so is life, right?
It's kind of like having teenage kids, parenting teenage kids.
Yeah.
I'll never speak to you again. It's okay. You still got to do your homework.
I'm never going to come out of my room.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, because I think for so many Washington-based reporters, January 6th is like, it will live in infamy. It obviously does for the country, but it's very deeply personal to many Washington political journalists. What was it like for you, and how has it, in your view, changed political reporting?
So I was actually I had gone to the protests about 8 a.m. or so, when they were kind of streaming down various, avenues near the Capitol, because we were kind of expecting that there might be confrontations between lawmakers and the protesters as they went into their office buildings. And so I interviewed a lot of the protesters. I'm sure some of them became rioters a few hours later, talking to people who had, were living in an alternative universe in terms of thinking that, Mike Pence is going to change his mind, or, God's going to intervene to throw out the electoral college votes. And it was kind of listening to people who did not trust the media, and they did not believe in democracy anymore, in terms of, hey, there's a process, Bill Barr, the Attorney General, said there was no significant fraud. And he was one of Trump's guys. And so, as my colleague and I, we kind of were talking to protesters. We didn't, and we knew that Trump had encouraged people to come down to Capitol Hill, but we were not at the, tip of the spear. I did not, expect them to rush the Capitol. And obviously most people did not expect them to do that, if the Capitol Police were totally outnumbered and they had not put the proper barriers that you might expect. And so it was kind of something that, of course there were warnings in terms of the, Capitol Police got those types of warnings, but to be fair, there's always going to be internet chatter about this and that. And so a lot of it was just not taken seriously, because you've seen these types of, you had seen previous Trump protests in the previous few months, and there's always going to be crazy stuff on the internet, on chat rooms, where it's a lot of bravado and not actually, taken out, happens. And so sometimes I kind of kick myself after, because I was thinking, if only I'd been at the tip of the spear, then I would have, gotten the footage that the New Yorker staff writer was taking with his iPhone camera and covered them as they stormed it. But no one, I think a lot of them were surprised themselves that they actually did storm it, because they expected, like all the rest of us, that the Capitol Police, or most of them, there's definitely some that were going to try, and no matter what. But there's other people who are just kind of caught up in, it's like a mob mentality. And so, but in terms of how it's changed journalism, I think there's kind of a view that this is what happens when there are lies that are spread unchecked. And so I don't think I think Trump was unique. I don't think if Josh Hawley or Ron DeSantis gets elected and they lose re-election, they care more about their reputations and are not going to challenge the electoral college results like this. And so it's been fascinating to see, in the last few months, just the amount of voting restrictions that Republican state legislatures have done to roll back these rules that were relaxed for the pandemic, and that some people thought, hey, it should be as easy to vote as possible, as provided you're not committing fraud. Why do we, if we're not going to give election day off, a lot of people will, wonder, there's a lot of people who are working 9-to-5 jobs or minimum wage and they have kids that are, going to school, and it's kind of hard for them to, take off an hour or two, especially if you have voting stations where there's hundreds of people waiting in line. It's going to take a while. And so it doesn't seem like January 6th has deterred Republicans from cracking down on voting rights, at least in the states.
That's interesting. As you were discussing your experience on January 6th, I'm thinking, if you were afraid, frankly, were you in harm's way that you might get caught up in violence? But here you are saying, man, I wish I was, at the point of the spear. I wish I could get that footage. Now, both of you have actually been in danger zones, war zones. Jessica, you had a question about that, right?
Yeah, I did, because it was a bug that bit me. I sent myself to Afghanistan in 2009, and I read that you sent yourself to the Syrian border in 2013. I was curious, because your body of work since then has largely not been that type of reporting. How did you do that? And do you miss the adrenaline? Because it's a different kind of adrenaline than the kind of reporting you're doing now.
That's kind of the fact that I went over there, makes you less afraid when something like January 6th rolls around. And so, by the time,
can I just paint the picture though? Did you have any body armor? Had you been through like classes on what to do with pepper spray or anything like that? Did you have any training prior to go?
I had taken one, training on keeping safe, staying safe in a protest zone, but
okay,
people didn't really expect that this would become so violent, where people were dying, and so the worry is that the protesters will turn on the media, but remember they were kicking AP, camera equipment, and but a lot of the protesters, they wanted the media to be there. They were kind of proud of what they were doing. And so they took lots of selfies and videos of themselves in the Capitol. And so I think if someone like me had, been in the Capitol kind of documenting what they were doing, I don't think they would have, turned on me, because, sometimes they would have, a lot of them were wearing masks, or like they might have tried to shield themselves, but it didn't seem like many people were shielding themselves. And so, and a lot of them kind of were allowed to just leave, and so it's been a painstaking process for the FBI to find everyone in every video clip. And I'm sure that there's like 1,000 people who stormed the Capitol, and they've only arrested 400. There's going to be a couple hundred that probably just get away with it because they, just by random acts of, they were lucky in terms of avoiding cameras, or just not being able to be easily identified. In a country of 320 million Americans, it's not like we have, thank God we don't have like a system like the Chinese are building in terms of everyone is tracked all the time. When I was freelancing after college, I had seen some stories about, the reporters were based in Antakya, which is Antioch in ancient times. And it's about an hour away from the Syrian border. And I thought to myself, I want to go and, see what this is all about. And so I went there for a few days, hired a translator, and did some stories on injured Syrian civilians, rebel leaders, refugees.
But you had no language skills. to get
No,
there,
I had
right?
a
And you had not
Arabic-
so you just figured out how to do this.
Arabic translator that had been recommended to me by
Okay.
a Christian Science Monitor reporter based in Istanbul. And I figured I think I had told a couple of outlets, hey, I'm going there. I might send you some articles after. But it was not, I didn't kind of have contracts where, hey, I'll write one story for the Washington Post, the New York Times. And my stories appeared in CNN, Huffington Post, a Saudi newspaper. And it was kind of, I thought that was very important. And I think there was government shutdowns happening at the same time, or spending caps. And so it just kind of, you feel the weight of history. This really matters. This is much more important than Washington bickering over, fiscal policy, even though that's important too. But this will be remembered. And, it was just such a tragedy. I thought I could help bring some small attention and light to my stories and, through my stories to that situation. And so it's definitely kind of an adrenaline rush, and you want to stay safe. So that's why I didn't cross the border. No story is worth losing one's life over, getting kidnapped. And I don't think I had ransom insurance, which is a real thing. And so, you don't want to stay too long, because then you kind of, people who have nefarious purposes, they're more apt to say, well, what's a tall white dude, who happens to be Jewish? If you look, my last name is more, they didn't know maybe they just did not know that I was Jewish. And so, why is he, going to the same cafe all the time? And so that's why it's kind of in and out. And so, but I really admire what, foreign reporters do, and made some friends on that trip that I still stay in touch with. But it's also frustrating that, the conflict is still going on these many, 7-8 years later. And so did my stories make an impact, or were they kind of, little like rocks that just drop or like trees that fall in forests that don't get noticed? But like totality, I did my small part in bringing light to a very important humanitarian crisis.
Has that affected, or how has that impacted, if in any way, your political reporting? I mean, I think there's a real distinction, because I felt it when I went to Afghanistan, between the conversation around these conflicts in Washington and the conflict and the conversation that's happening in the region. And they're often really divorced of each other, because the pros and cons are very different. But until you see it for yourself, you don't really know how much more humanity is on the line. It's not just, it's less policy, more people when you get on the ground.
Yeah.
Just wondering how that impacted you later on.
At the time, a lot of journalists were thinking to themselves, who were actually there, why isn't the U.S. Even putting a no-fly zone to prevent Syrian military from bombing civilians that you're meeting the casualties of? And so some things that kind of feel more obvious when you're on the ground there. But in terms of how it's impacted my political reporting, it's hard to say exactly, but it kind of puts things in perspective that, when I'm doing a political story, it's within kind of the bounds of democratic norms, and that, we're not fighting each other in the streets. You don't see senators caning each other on the Senate floor anymore. And so the physical element of that type of danger is gone, in terms of, it kind of makes you treasure democracy more when you've seen, when there's no democracy, what happens, and when there's not respect for individual rights, and when people feel the need to have to fight for their own rights against a brutal dictator. So I guess term limits are important for the presidency, and the free press and the courts and all of the democratic norms. And so that's why during the Trump years, there was obviously those people worried about, would the courts buckle, or is democracy at risk? But I was more optimistic, because a lot of these things are well established, and so if the Supreme Court says something, they're not going to. You saw that the people that put Trump on, that he put on the court, even they were not going to, save him. So
It's interesting and encouraging. The conservative legal movement was one of the great heroes of this last chapter. Even Trump appointed judges from the challenges between Election Day and January 6th, his own Supreme Court justices. They were the ones who were the bulwark against,
Yeah.
a very different looking democracy taking over, if you can call it that.
I think it's a matter of kind of, they have the long view, and, people who are lawyers, if there's no evidence to support voter fraud, like, they're not going to say, well, their clerks are not going to write those types of rulings. And, the clerks are the ones often doing the work. And so they have to think about their own careers too. And, we still live in a democracy. And so that type of stuff is not rewarded.
Yeah. Good journalism is sometimes referred to as the first draft of history. Looking back at your body of work, which pieces do you think will be referred back to as part of the historical record? You had mentioned one, your work overseas, but
I think I've kind of been, trying to think about what stories are, long lasting. I think often stories that are in, magazine stories. I did a piece about how last year about what the Confederate, or the descendants of Confederate generals have to say, whose ancestors are named on those military bases. And so no one had really talked to them about, hey, what do they think? And it turns out there were varying opinions. And so that kind of added to the conversation. And I think that piece, if you read that in 10 years, it'll still be interesting and new. And it's not this person got this job, and, a type of story that is, doesn't live on in terms of being as relevant. But I did a story in the 2016 campaign about kind of counting Trump's misstatements and lies, and finding that every few minutes he was saying something untrue, and then it declined. He became less truthful 6 months later during the campaign. And so that was President Obama referred to that piece, and of course everyone knew they would have individual fact checks, but we kind of reviewed a few months of stuff, or I think it was actually 1 week of stuff that he would say and tweet about. And so that kind of, I'm proud of that piece. And I think it's I did a story about how the Trump transition was warned, hey, there's going to be, there could be a 1918 style pandemic, and during the transition between Obama and Trump, and they kind of put that in the back of their mind for until it actually hit. And so could stuff have been done differently? Could we have worked with China to develop better partnerships to combat these types of things and nip them at the bud? And so all these are kind of unknowable questions, but the historical record, hey, the Trump team at least was warned. I'm sure that there's going to be warnings about future things that become a problem. And so, if you guys watch and read The Looming Tower, that's plenty of warnings. Even Obama saying North Korea is going to be your biggest challenge. Well, I guess it, didn't turn out to be, but it was one of the challenges that Trump faced.
For sure. I'm curious, actually, from both of you, how, speaking of COVID and the pandemic, what kinds of new obstacles that created for you? Like, we talked before about how you cultivate relationships and cultivate sources. Did it make things more difficult for you to do your day-to-day work?
I think it definitely did, and to some extent, because you're not meeting as many new people, and you're not, getting tips as much in person that I would usually get. And so that's why I was fortunate to have a lot of sources going into the pandemic, where if they had my phone number, I had their phone number, then we can kind of work together. So that's one, that's going to be a perk of American DC reopening, where people are less worried about getting coffee and all of that. But if someone has a story that they want to tell, get told, my phone number's on my Twitter bio. And so they know how to get in touch with you. And so, but it definitely kind of makes it more challenging, especially I feel bad for, reporters who are just going into their beats or into the profession. or people switching, getting new jobs where they haven't even met most of their colleagues.
Yeah. I mean, I would echo that and just add maybe that you have to work doubly hard just to even stay out of your own bubble of what's sort of created by the people that you not spend time with in your personal life, because that's a danger too, or even in your neighborhood. I mean, I'm out in the suburbs. That's a different vibe than a lot of the, and I have government folks and people in government in my neighborhood, but I can walk by their house, but the proximity and the sort of way you have to struggle against tunnel vision is definitely a factor. I had a question about Derek Chauvin, and that was probably the last, kind of to wrap things up. That was obviously the big verdict. We saw how Biden handled it beforehand and since with his public announcements. I'm just curious what your thoughts are, or if you've done actual reporting on the decision making that went on inside the White House to decide when to have the president initially comment about the Derek Chauvin verdict, and how do you see this kind of playing out or moving forward? Because it does seem like they're very openly pushing, obviously, for legislation, but there's a real delicate balance to be a voice on race, something that even President Obama was very hesitant to do.
No, yeah, that's a great, question. I don't have specific reporting about how, why and how Biden, and the Biden team decided to weigh in, but I think they felt like it was an important moment in our country when you have a cop who is held responsible for this type of action, which had such ramifications around the world, and so. I think there was some criticism of him before, when the jury was sequestered, saying, "I'm hoping for the right verdict," because Trump would get criticized when he would want to weigh in, or he would kind of tip the scales. And so obviously they didn't hear what Biden said, but it's symbolic, and so he might not have said that, but in the future. But I think because those are important norms to hold fast to, that you want juries to kind of consider the evidence and then make their own decision. But the Biden team feels like that they need to kind of use this moment to try to get some reforms of how police work, and that everyone, in the White House, they are largely of the belief that the vast majority of cops are they do a good job. They want to protect the public, but there are going to be, they kind of have closed ranks before, and that there are, I won't use the term like bad apples, because it feels like these things have happened. There's been so many police shootings that need investigations, and that appear. Why didn't the police hold their fire? Why didn't they use a taser? Or, why are they pulling around an African American soldier and treating him horribly? And so I think they don't want to let this opportunity go to waste in terms of delivering some reform of the system, and kind of potentially making it easier to sue police departments, maybe instead of individual cops. And so that qualified immunity is probably going to get changed. It just depends on if they can get enough votes in the Senate, and it's not a budgetary issue, so it can't be snuck in through reconciliation, but they're going to try their hardest to get that passed. But they also have so many other priorities that they're trying to pass at the same time.
Yeah, it is interesting. When the jury's decision was announced, it was one of those moments like January 6th where I thought reasonable people can agree on certain things. Like, the process was followed, justice was carried out in a proper way. There was so much evidence that supported the final ruling. Just like January 6th, this is, reasonable people can agree that mobs storming the Capitol is a bad thing, and yet that day, in both instances, narratives were already forming, that there were these bubbles in which narratives were already forming. Like on January 6th, that day I was listening to Wilkow and Levin to your point, the point that you made before about diversifying your news consumption and commentary consumption portfolio. And that day, those talking points were already emerging. Like, where was your outrage when, they referred to violence in Portland, and well, what did you expect? Because the election was stolen, and there were certain talking points that were already emerging that day, and it can be discouraging. But I think a large majority of reporters, journalists, commentators were, could say, you know what, justice was done, that the process was followed. This was a fair trial.
The system worked.
The system worked. We don't have to, I don't know. It was just, sometimes it's discouraging to hear that folks are looking for these threads to pull in order to keep a level of vitriol at a certain level, so that was part of my, but for the most part, again, it was, this is justice working. So, sorry, not to put too much my own commentary on that, but it was just an observation about how the news, how some stories emerge and narratives emerge and quickly congeal. And I'll ask sort of a similar question that I just asked Jessica, if we forgot to ask anything. Is there anything else that you'd like to add?
I don't think so. This has been a great conversation. So yeah. Thank you so much.
Daniel, when are you going to write a book?
Yeah, when are you going to write a book?
I'll give you guys the exclusive on that.
Yeah, let's break some news, buddy. Come on, you have a contract?
I will, I
notice you've been talking to a lot of publishers lately.
I have for
stories.
For various
That's
stories.
A good cover story.
Yeah, it's good contacts that I've been developing. So if I ever do want to write a book, I'll know a bunch of people. Yeah.
Did you have one last question and one piece of business? Did you have any questions for us?
No, I am eager to kind of listen to your podcast and see how it develops, and excited and honored to have been invited on.
Yeah, thanks for giving us some time. This was a great conversation, and it was great to follow up on an earlier conversation we had with Julie Mason, another great supporter of good journalism and good journalists. So we really appreciate it. Before we go, how can our audience find you?
Sure. So I'm on Twitter at dlippman, DLIPPMAN. And they can also email me at daniel@politico.com.
Terrific. Jessica, it's fun hanging out with you as always.
We're keeping it real. I noticed nobody screamed. It was a magical hour.
Oh, that's because Ronnie wasn't here. My dad is our sometime co-host. So if we had him, then yeah, the spit would be flying. Daniel, thanks again for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Of course.
Thank you for joining us today. If you appreciate what you heard here, please go to iTunes or anywhere you get your podcasts. Give us a 5-star rating and leave a review. That really helps move us up the chart so others can find out what we're up to here. For Ronnie Nathan, I'm Corey Nathan, and we've been talking politics and religion without killing each other. We'll be back in a few days to do our little part in Tikkun Olam.